Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. We're very pleased to be able to be joined by David Riedman and have you have opportunities to ask him questions. We'll learn about his background. I'm Lori Holine. I am the program director for Idaho State University's Homeland Security and Emergency Management degree program. So we are planning this webinar. We have another webinar scheduled for Thursday as well, and we hope to be offering monthly webinars coming up in the future. Just for logistics, we have a Q&A function as opposed to the chat window in this particular webinar. So go ahead and please use that. We want to hear your questions, and I may, see if we're able to, if you also want to raise your hand, if you know that you have a question, I'll see if I'm able to go ahead and allow you to ask those questions directly. Otherwise, please be thinking of some questions that we can share. And so at this point, I would like to introduce you to our professor, Angela English. So Angie, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
Hey, thank you so much, Lori, and thank you, David, for joining us today on this important topic. I'm going to do a little brief introduction of David, and then he's going to present his slide presentation, and then we'll have lots of time for questions from the audience. So David is a 2015 master's graduate from the Naval Postgraduate School, Center for Homeland Defense and Security. And he's been a keynote speaker for some of the largest conferences for public health. He is a firefighter of 18 years in Maryland. He's studying now to get his PhD. I had the personal privilege to meet David when we were both in a program at the Center for Homeland Defense and Security called HSX, or Advanced Thinking in Homeland Security. And this is where David got the idea for a database to track school shootings. And I know he's going to go into detail about that. This particular database has been used as a primary data source in over 80 peer-reviewed articles and reports, and it's been cited in over 1,000 media outlets, including the New York Times, The Guardian, Chicago Tribune, National Public Radio, Wall Street Journal, Denver Post, New York Post, and so many more. And he's also an adjunct professor at Aurora University, and is currently enrolled, as I said, in a PhD program, at the University of Central Florida. So David, we're so thankful that you've chosen to spend a little time with us tonight, and we'll let you get started.
Thank you so much, Angie and Lori. So really appreciate the opportunity to talk with the class, share a little bit of information on school shootings. I know that this is a topic that resonates with a lot of different people. So I hope you all can see my slides now. Angie, can you see this?
Yes, I can see them, David.
Okay, perfect. So I'm just going to talk for about 20 minutes and then answer questions on anything that relates to the topic of school shootings. Obviously, something like Uvalde, captured a lot of attention. And when we think about school shootings, things like Parkland and Sandy Hook and Columbine come to mind. But it's actually a much deeper issue. It's a much broader issue. There are a lot of different things that are going on, both with deliberate attacks and then with systemic gun violence. And that's something that is extending across the country in all types of communities. And, we see crime stats on a delay. The FBI, a Uniform Crime Report, when that comes out and gives us the national picture of gun violence, we're seeing information that's 2 years behind. And that's showing from the 2019 and 2020 numbers that there's a dramatic increase in violent crime and gun violence across the country. And what the school shooting database is both a historical reference in terms of these mass attacks, different types of attacks everything that goes back to 1970 in schools, but it's also a window into a real-time look at gun violence across the country, because community level issues that filter onto school property are really representative of the larger communities. I'm going to talk more about that. So just looking at so far this year, there have been 223 different times when a gun was fired at a school. And when I say a gun is fired at school, that can be an attack like Robb Elementary, or that can be a fight in the hallway where a student pulls a gun and shoots somebody else. Both of those have profound impacts on the entire operation of that school and kind of the security posture of the entire jurisdiction. But within these kind of classic school shootings and these targeted attacks, in the last couple of years, we've really seen every one of the different worst case scenarios that you could have. So in 2022, of those 223 incidents, Robb Elementary was a rampage shooting. It was somebody going into the school with the intent to kill as many people as possible. But just a couple weeks before that, at the Edmund Burke School in Washington, D.C., there was a sniper attack. And that's something that's pretty rare at schools. Very similar to the Las Vegas Harvest Festival. A person had rented a 5th floor apartment that overlooked the school. They had 1,000 rounds of ammo and 6 automatic rifles, and live streamed the shooting on 4chan. And really, really lucky situation. The person had terrible aim and didn't know how to operate the weapons. And even though they had this elevated position and all of this ammo and firepower, only 4 people were wounded. 2021, there are 249 different shootings, by far the worst year on history, double what we'd seen in 2019 and 20, along with this pattern where this year's probably going to be even worse than last year was in terms of the number of incidents. But there was also kind of the full gambit of different types of targeted attacks at school. So in Oxford, Michigan, there was the classic rampage shooting of somebody with the intent to kill as many people as possible. Just a couple months before that, Ridgeby Middle in Idaho, a 12-year-old girl had 2 handguns and multiple magazines of extra ammunition, and she had a written plan that she hoped to kill 20 to 30 students and wound 50 others. And this was a 12-year-old girl. Fortunately, she started to fire in the hallway, and a teacher walked out of the classroom just as she was raising the gun and disarmed her as she took the first couple shots. At San Diego High, just before that, there was an evening hostage standoff at the school. So there was an incident that occurred near the school. It resulted in a police chase. A man took a woman hostage and climbed into a dumpster that was near the football field of the school. And it turned into a multi-hour hostage negotiation. This happened at about 8 p.m. on a weeknight. And pretty much every week of the year, you're going to have school events. You're going to have different athletic events, after school activities, evening meetings, community events at the school. This just happened to happen on a night where there were not any school events going on because this person drove right across the campus, drove to the football field, and that's where the hostage situation occurred. If they had been able to get into the school or there had been an event going on, this would have been very different. And that's part of why it's so important to have a really wide definition of a school shooting and why this project has had the intent of capturing as many incidents as possible and getting this kind of holistic picture of gun violence on school grounds. Just a couple months before that, at the Yes Prep School in Texas, there was a targeted attack by a former student. It was a secure campus, the doors were locked. He had a rifle and shot out the windows and climbed in through the broken glass and then fired down the hallway before he surrendered. But he had the intent of targeting specific staff members that were there. Not surprisingly, during 2020, there were not any targeted attacks because classes were really not in session. But what there were is, as lots of public spaces were closed, community level violence started taking place on school campuses. So when people couldn't go to the mall or a park or other places that were closed, they ended up congregating on school campuses. And there were lots of fights between community members on the school that escalated into a shooting. Now you might ask, what does that have to do with the school? You still had students and community members using the playgrounds, using rec facilities, schools that were, partially open or in hybrid learning. Sometimes teachers were teaching in the classroom when a shooting occurred outside. And when there was the mentality that there are no schools open, so there aren't any school shootings, there's not going to be the same attention paid to security on a school campus. And then in 2019, there was a rampage shooting at Salgis High School. This was in Southern California. There's a lot of discussion about the profile of a school shooter. And we think of this deranged outcast, somebody that is having mental illness and depression and all types of other issues. This was a straight A student who was on a college path. He was in a STEM program, played varsity sports, had a girlfriend, had a strong social structure, had never had any disciplinary issues other than turning in one assignment late in his 4 years at the school. And he shot 5 classmates and then killed himself in an 18-second time period when classes changed. No suicide note, no manifesto, no explanation of why this happened. That came right after another STEM school shooting. This was at the STEM school in Boulder, just about 15 miles from Columbine. And this was unique because it was a rampage shooting that involved 2 different shooters. So it was a complex coordinated attack where they were going to go in different parts of the school and herd the students together and continue shooting. Both of them were disarmed by students and staff members. One person died, I think 8 or 9 were injured. But this was a very significant incident because first it occurred so close to Columbine in an area that is very committed to behavioral threat assessments, to school security. And it was the first shooting involving 2 attackers since Columbine. It was also a situation where overt red flags were missed over and over. These students were known as potential school shooters. They talked about committing school shootings. They made threats to other classmates. Some of the students were so scared that prior to the shooting, when one of the students reached into his bag during a class, students ran out of the classroom. And this occurred in a jurisdiction miles from Columbine, 20 years after that shooting, yet no action was taken. Looking across kind of the mass fatality incidents that get a lot of attention, incidents where there are 10 or more people killed, what's very fortunate is they're extraordinarily rare. So including community colleges and universities, since this is a university presentation, there have only been 8 different incidents all the way back to 1970 where more than 10 people were killed. And that is part of why when there's national attention on how to address school shootings, we really need to open the aperture and realize that it's preventing all types of gun violence on campus, not just preventing these mass casualty attacks. This is some information from the K-12 school shooting database website. You can see any of this if you want to. It's all updated in real time on k12ssdb.org. You can also follow at K12SSDB, where I tweet out quite a bit of information every day and during incidents about school shootings. But here on this chart, looking from 1970 to present, this is all types of gun violence on school property. It's pretty steady back to 1970 through 2017. And then in 2017, the number of incidents doubles. And this follows the national trends based on the FBI data for gun violence and violent crime nationwide. And then in 2021 and 2022, where there is no unified crime report data available yet, those numbers from 18 through 20 have doubled. So I think it's very likely that the rate of violent crime and gun violence across the entire country has doubled. And that's something that experts were already talking about as a very significant issue based on the 19 and 20 numbers. So things are likely to get significantly worse. In terms of the situation, every one of the incidents is coded for why it happened. And the most common situation is an escalation of a dispute. But the second leading cause is accidents. And many of these accidents involve armed school resource officers, teachers who have weapons, parents who have weapons, and students who are showing off weapons. And there's a lot of discussion nationally about the need for law enforcement officers in every school, the need for more school resource officers. It's important to balance with that the introduction of any weapon brings additional risk. So there have been 2 incidents in the past 3 weeks where school resource officers who had significant time on the job and had prior sworn law enforcement experience accidentally fired their weapons inside the school building. One of the incidents was a school resource officer in his office. The bullet went across a hallway, across a classroom that was occupied, and lodged in the bookcase. So it's important to kind of think about the entire picture of risk at a school. And those incidents with 10 people or more killed, very rare. Mass attacks, also fairly rare. But accidents, the second most common incident to occur in school. This chart is filtered for just active shooter incidents at schools. And this is important because it's not a new phenomenon. So these active shooters are kind of your classic school shooting, somebody at the school with the intent to harm as many people as possible. And they've occurred all the way back to 1971. And these are prior to social media, prior to violent video games, prior to R-rated movies, prior to any of the different kind of culture war issues that are brought up now. The same type of violence was occurring. Here's a map just showing those most deadly incidents. They've occurred in all parts of the country. What is of note here is that 5 of the 10 most deadly have been in communities with less than a 25,000 person population. So very small communities like Jonesboro, Arkansas, or Uvalde, or Nichols Mines, Pennsylvania. And what that means is that these jurisdictions don't have the same level of resources for training, for incident command. You're not going to be getting the same quality and caliber of standard police officer that you would when you're in a major metro area, just because there's not the funding, institutional knowledge, training, major events for them to have experience from. And that really played out in Uvalde, where you had somebody that was a very incompetent incident commander. If that shooting had occurred in a major jurisdiction, the incident commander would have been, somebody that had more experience. In addition to the shootings that did happen, there has been a lot of success. This is just a sample of a few, but there have been averted shootings that were very significant attacks where people had a plan. Some involved multiple students. The assailants had weapons, had ammo, and these were all averted because somebody knew there was a problem and said something about it. That's really the key to stopping these incidents. When Robb Elementary occurred, there was a lot of kind of public discourse around how could this happen in an elementary school? But actually, elementary schools have been the location of some of the most serious incidents all the way back to the 1970s. So one of the first kind of notorious school shooters was a girl who lived directly across from an elementary school. And she fired a rifle from the window, from her bedroom window, and shot 12 people at the school. And that was back in 1979. But after that, in about 5-year increments, or so throughout the 1980s, there were major attacks at elementary schools. And that kind of culminated in 1989 at Cleveland Elementary School in Stockton. And that was a homeless person with some severe mental illness, drug abuse, criminal history, bought a semi-auto rifle, and he shot 38 people, mostly children, at the elementary school. And that led to California's assault weapons ban. So some of these incidents have been a spur for some kind of broader changes and some legislative changes. This is just another chart kind of highlighting those active shooter incidents, but focusing on how many people have been killed. And a troubling trend here is that while these incidents have been common since 1970, the number of people killed has increased significantly in the last 10 years. So where there was one incident, with more than 10 fatalities over those first 40 years, there have been 4 incidents in the last 10. This is another chart just kind of looking across the number of incidents compared to fatalities, and this includes Virginia Tech also. And you can see that, over time, these incidents are increasing in fatality. They're also increasing in the total number of victims. So here in this chart, the light gray is fatalities, the darker gray is wounded. And this really paints kind of a bleak picture of how many more victims there have been in recent years. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit just so there can be a little more time of questions. But a takeaway that I'd want everybody to have from this is that these mass shootings are not random acts. The shooters have experienced some sort of trauma. It can be personal, it can be social, it can be professional. In most cases, they're students or former students, so it relates to the school. And what happens is when they have this unresolved trauma, they start developing a grievance. And in the case of a school shooting, they're blaming the school for their problems. So they have some serious issue. In the case of Uvalde, it was severe bullying, it was sexual abuse at home, and it was asking for help in that 4th grade classroom and not receiving any help and not having the teachers listen to him that created this grievance where for the next 10 years, he continued to stew and become more violent until when he turned 18, he got the capability to purchase the weapons. And then he returned to his 4th grade classroom to the point where that trauma had started and where that grievance was directed. These shootings are a final act. There's no escape plan. They plan to die during the attack. In most cases, they're suicidal. That means that things like increasing security is not a deterrent. If anything, it can make it more attractive because it can make it a bigger final act, a bigger spectacle. And then there's months and years of planning before these attacks. They don't happen out of the blue. And they've been writing plans, telling others, sometimes attempting to recruit others, trying to get firearms. The Uvalde shooter had been asking his older sister to buy him firearms for years, but she refused. And when all of these pieces come together, eventually they carry out the plan. And it follows, this crisis cycle from, just any standard kind of mental health course about how things build to this point of crisis. And what you need to do is stop violence before it bubbles up to this point of crisis. Oxford, the attack, all of these warning signs that you would, they just become kind of commonplace throughout these shootings. Uvalde had exactly the same warning signs, including overt social media posts and the shooter being known as school shooter on social media. I touched on it briefly. Here's the Edmund Burke School in Washington, D.C. There's the 5th floor apartment is that yellow box, and he fired down into that alley between the school right at dismissal with the intent to really harm as many people as possible. Fortunately, He had very poor aim, and after he fired his initial shots, he commits suicide. This is just an image from the live stream, and this is his rifle sight. And you can see these students running across this glass bridge after the first volley of shots, and he has the rifle sight right on them, but wasn't able to aim the weapon and fire it. He ended up firing into the air, and some bullets struck buildings 2 miles away from the school. So there's a lot more detail I could go into. These presentations can be hours long, but I really want to take the opportunity to answer as many of your questions as possible. Here's my information. You can contact me with any follow-up questions that you have. Please follow the social media links, and the website has a lot of information too. So with that, I will turn it over to Angie to ask some questions.
David, thank you so much. This is an incredible amount of work. It's mind-boggling to me. So we're going to open it up. We've got some of the best students in the world at Idaho State University, and currently I'm teaching a class on psychology and social psychology of terrorism, and with Professor Holeen, one on critical issues and systems thinking. And so we probably have a mixture of students as well as some faculty. So they're awesome students and faculty. So let's see what questions people have. And Lori's going to be our question moderator.
Sure, thank you. And thank you, David. Definitely appreciate chilling that last image you showed of the scope with the students that were running through that glass archway is just chilling. And certainly this is a topic that should be mobilizing communities all over the country. So here's a question. April would like to ask, can you give some examples of escalated disputes that resulted in a shooting?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there were actually just a couple of those this past week. So if anybody's interested, you can search online. You can search ESPN other school shootings. There's a feature article on ESPN this week, which I pitched back in August, and it's about shootings at high school football games. There have been about 170 of those in the last 10 years, and the majority of them are disputes that escalate. Just last week in Philadelphia, there was a fight at a high school during lunch, and the fight involved some players on the football team and some other players. There's a scrimmage at the school that evening. So when the players were leaving the school, there was another group of students in an SUV, and they were waiting by the gate. And when the specific students came out that they were targeting, these 5 different teenage shooters, all wearing masks, fired more than 100 shots at them. They killed one, they wounded 4 others. One of the shooters ran down and stood over one of the fallen victims, and he was attempting to execute him, but his gun jammed. And then they all fled. They were wearing masks. None of them have been identified or arrested at this point, but that's just kind of a dispute during lunchtime turns into a targeted shooting by 5 assailants just a couple hours later outside of the school. There were 2 shootings Friday night at games. They were both disputes that escalated. One was right next to the stands, and the shooter killed a 17-year-old, wounded another 17-year-old, but the shots hit random people in the stands, and a 9-year-old girl was wounded, and a 20-year-old woman, totally unsuspecting bystanders were wounded. So these fights that escalate are not isolated incidents in any manner. They can have profound impacts on all the bystanders that are caught in the crossfire. Last year at a school in Buffalo, there was a fight at dismissal. It escalated into a shooting. One student was shot. A security guard tried to intervene. He was shot by a student. And then that 16-year-old fled. Because of that shooting, the teachers at the school said this is an unsafe work environment. And the school was closed for 2 months. And the teachers union still has a grievance against the school district and is threatening a strike almost a year later over that fight that escalated into a shooting. So those are the other school shootings that don't have national days of prayer, don't have Secret Service threat assessment teams to look at. They happen in some of the most underprivileged schools in the country to some very disadvantaged students, and they get almost no attention and no resources to try to stop them or help the victims afterwards.
Yeah, it's very complex. So we have another question. Neil is asking, do you see the cause of these school shootings as being mental health problem, an attitude problem, a gun problem, or something else?
Severe mental illness is very rare. So there were a couple shootings in the 1980s, especially that incident at Stockton Elementary, where it was a man who was homeless and had severe mental illness and lots of interactions with law enforcement. But that has not been the case in the past 30 years. The school shooters and mass shooters in general, from the past 30 years or so, follow that same pattern where there's a specific unresolved trauma, and that trauma gets turned into a grievance against something. And that can be their employer, could be the employer where their ex-wife works, it could be their school, it could be a church, it can be whatever is representing this. The trauma is severe in some sort. One thing that one of my colleagues who's had the opportunity to interview mass shooters who are incarcerated, her saying is, the worse that the shooting was, the worse the trauma was. The sadder the attack, the sadder the backstory. And the people that have committed a lot of these mass shootings have been severely abused themselves, often sexually abused as children. And then they were never able to get any help, or they asked for help and didn't get it. And then they start directing that blame and those feelings towards the people that didn't give them help. Now, this doesn't justify violence in any way, shape, or form. I'm not suggesting that that's the appropriate course for anyone to take. But if we want to have any meaningful preventative measures, we need to understand that these aren't a random psychopath that picks up a gun one day. It's somebody that has a pattern of trauma and cries for help for years and years. And if you create a mechanism to see that, if you create formal crisis intervention programs, a lot of these things can be stopped before a shot's ever fired.
Well, I think that's powerful. You've mentioned several times about how there's a trauma involved. There's some type of blame that gets built up in the shooter's mind. Just where do you see that intervention point? Do you see that taking place more, not so much with security or school resource officers or law enforcement, but at the school level? What are some recommendations that may have helped elsewhere, or are we seeing some research in that area?
Yeah, I mean, there have been more averted incidents than actual incidents, and that shows that things are working. And the shootings that have been averted are because these are public acts. These are not planned in private. Somebody who has experienced this trauma, who's directed this grievance, is almost always telling people about their anger because they're asking for help. They're making really overt cries for help. The shooter in Oxford, Michigan, his parents had purchased him the gun, just prior to the shooting, and now they're both on trial as well. But he had been writing on assignments that he needed help. He'd had 3 different conversations with school staff members where he said he needed help, that he was having these violent feelings, that he had voices in his head that were telling him to do this. He was asking his parents for help. He was texting his mom saying, please take me back to the counselor. This was somebody that had extreme trauma, had very negligent and abusive parents, and then within the school asking for help, to the point where the morning before the shooting, he was there in the school counselor's office looking at an assignment where he had drawn a person with a gun and drawn bleeding people and drawn a picture of the school, and he had the gun in his backpack, and none of the 3 adults in the room recognized the problem, took it away from him, stopped him, or got him any help. And that's where these incidents could have been stopped. Uvalde could have been stopped. Oxford could have been stopped. Dozens of others could have been stopped if one person was familiar with recognizing a person in crisis and you had a system in place to provide them with assistance.
All right, we have another question. What have you learned from the data analysis that we can use to help prevent future shootings? And I think you just kind of addressed those interdiction opportunities.
Yeah, and
Does
so that
data
speaks to mass public, to those really deliberate attacks. What the data shows, looking at all types of shootings on school property, is that this is actually a much broader problem than we previously understood. Because when there's a shooting at a school that injures one person or injures 2 people, it might only make local news if it's a fight at dismissal. And that by itself doesn't seem like a problem until you start piecing the data together and you realize that there have been 250 other shootings just like that, and that there are more victims of these other school shootings than there are from the rampage shootings. So that's really, I think, the power of this data, is realizing some of these trends that you wouldn't be able to put together at just the local level. There's no national reporting standard for any type of school violence. There's no Department of Education Office of School Violence. Nobody pulls together these reports. In some cases, there may not be any state level reporting. Schools can be independent school districts across the state. Unless they have somebody who's putting this information together, it's not going to be reported at the state level. So the only way to start seeing kind of the scope of some of these issues was collecting this information nationally and then being able to aggregate it together.
Yeah, well, so we have several questions that all are kind of along the same thread of asking about security and why maybe the presence of security could even backfire as to actually propel for more intensity of the incident. But some people, we have some questions from our participants here that are asking about, is there other physical security measures that have proven to be helpful, whether that's reinforced bulletproof glass, metal detectors, etc., anything like that that shifts the school culture in a way that could be a deterrence?
It's interesting. So a peer-reviewed study of those indiscriminate attacks found that schools that had an armed officer on the premise had 3 times as many victims as schools without one. And when a mass shooting is planned as somebody's final act, part of the planning can be going somewhere that has an armed police presence. So there was the shooting in Buffalo at the grocery store, just a couple months ago. I think it was last May or June. That shooter had written extensively in his manifesto about targeting an elementary school. But once he did surveillance of the elementary school, and once he did surveillance of these grocery stores, he decided on the grocery store. It's not exactly clear why he picked that over the elementary school. The grocery store did have 2 armed guards there. So that may have kind of played into his plan for it to be, a tactical spectacle where he had body armor and weapons, and he was live streaming it, and he wanted it to be, as big of kind of a spectacle as possible. So when somebody is suicidal and they're planning suicide by cop, that armed person can become something that makes the target more attractive. In terms of fortification, that's a really slippery slope right now. So something that's occurring at schools across the country is one-way locks are being installed in classrooms. And so these are locks like drop bars or pins or hooks on the bottom of the door, where that classroom door can only be opened from the inside. And in some cases, it's a reinforced door that's being added, and then it has a steel drop bar behind it. Well, in a situation like Uvalde, if the shooter can get inside the classroom and then has a way to close a fortified door and put a drop bar down, there's no way that any patrol officer is going to be able to get into that room. And looking at these cases, the shooters are students or former students. They know the operations of the school very well. They know exactly where the weak points are. They know when the janitor takes the trash out and the door's propped open. They're going to find a way into the school. They're going to find a weakness. And then all of that fortification within the school, the students are being trained on how to use it. Students are being trained on the procedures. Students know exactly where people are going to go, where they're going to be. And when the school shooter is an inside threat, they know that plan and they're going to find ways to defeat the plan. So the more that the school is fortified, the more potential it has to be a situation where the shooter can exploit it and then law enforcement is inhibited by it.
Wow. So Auden has a question here. You've mentioned some examples of these warning signs that were happening in the school environment before these shootings took place. Why actually do you think there's a lack of intervention before these attacks occurred? What's happening? Why isn't that intervention taking place?
Yeah, it's a lack of resources. I mean, many schools don't have a full-time counselor. Even ones who do, the person, may have minimal training or, no formal training. The school counselor at Oxford High was sitting in a formal evaluation with the student and his parents while he had a gun in his backpack, looking at a picture that he drew, and knowing that he'd made prior threats. That's a situation that has to come down to a lack of training and a lack of competency. And our schools, unfortunately, the budgets are very poor. A lot of schools are struggling just to keep, the lights on, to keep equipment in classrooms. Classroom sizes are growing. Teachers' salaries, are very poor. And a lot of schools don't have resources for any mental health services, much less somebody, who would be able to intervene in a crisis.
So Jonathan Gaddy is one of our faculty members, and he has a question. Jonathan, would you like to go ahead and ask your question? He wasn't probably expecting me to invite him to speak live, so.
Hey, Lori. David, I was
Jonathan.
just curious with respect to the emergency management students that are here thinking about how they might engage. Can you talk to us a little bit about what the role of the emergency manager is before, during, and after these events?
Absolutely. I have a whole separate presentation from big city emergency managers that I gave a couple of years ago. So I would have broke that out if I knew that was the right topic. But I mean, thinking about the entire emergency management cycle, there are a lot of pieces that get left out of the planning process. So, as school shooting exercise primarily involves law enforcement, might involve, fire department. Often emergency management never gets invited to the table. But on the preparedness side, looking at the school's plan, making sure the plan is updated, making sure all the players involved know the plan, know what people are doing, have what they need. You know, a situation like Uvalde, if you had an emergency manager there prior to that, you'd realize, okay, the police officers responding to this don't have schematics of the school, don't have keys to the school, their radios don't work inside the school, and the person who might be the incident commander has no formal training in incident command. That's something an emergency manager would recognize during an exercise at that, you know, preparedness point in the process. And what gets lost in a lot of these, there are tons of trainings. They have the same lessons learned that come out of them. But a lot of these lessons learned are either never captured or never collected, because emergency managers understand that continuous improvement process. When there's an exercise and it just involves law enforcement or just law enforcement and fire, you know, something can go wrong in an exercise, and instead of coming up with a corrective action plan, nothing happens. When you get into the response phase, you can have a situation where you have dozens or even hundreds of agencies responding. You need unified command, need to be thinking about you know, personnel rotations, deconflicting different information, building a common operating picture, having unified communications, and then within just a couple hours, all of your mass care pieces, restrooms, feeding, shelter. There's never been a school shooting, fortunately, during a bad rainstorm or a blizzard, but you not only have responders who are there that are out of the elements, but you have all these students that have run out of the school, probably without their jackets. Who's going to see that kind of bigger picture, be able to recognize all the needs, and then know all of those other resources that you need to bring? We need city buses here. We need a church open. We need mobile feeding. We need temporary clothing, all of these things that get lost. And then moving into the recovery piece, it's going to be after, whether it's a shooting like Buffalo, where it's a fight in the hallway and the school's closed for weeks, or whether it's a situation like Uvalde, where the school's going to be a crime scene for a year and then it's demolished. There's a long-term recovery element there. It's figuring out the other places kids are going to go, the other places all of the people involved with that school and that community are going to go, alternate sites, donations management, different events management. When you have the trial, when you have you know, funeral services and things, every one of those could be an international media event, and emergency management can be planning and understanding those resources, figuring out how you need to execute mutual aid. If you've had a small police department that's been involved with an incident for 14 days straight, you're going to need somebody else coming into the jurisdiction to handle patrol for a period of time after that. And then finally, on the mitigation front, there are resources available. It's a matter of understanding in an all hazards plan, understanding when pursuing grant funding, to get pieces that can apply to as many different scenarios as possible, and making sure that they're used in every scenario possible. So when you get, you know, that mass feeding capability, or you get the new incident command bus, or whatever else through the grant funding, making sure that it's out there for every exercise, so that when the real thing happens, people know what resources you have and know how to use them. Does that answer your question, John?
David, thank you for that. I was just going to share that I worked for the state of Oregon during the Umpqua Community College. I was the deputy director at the State Office of Emergency Management. And there was so much support for the community that needed to be coordinated, and resources that needed to be brought forward. And it was you know, one of those rare incidents where there was more than 10, there were 10 that were killed and others injured. And it became, the other incident that had to be managed after that occurred was the media. The media, we had President Obama came to the location as a presidential visit. We had Secret Service. We had some protesters that wanted to co-opt the media spotlight that were quite intrusive to the whole sensitivity of the issue. There was just quite a lot of additional challenges, and then getting some behavioral, mental health supports for those grieving families, and just even lots of other people, whether it be teachers or other students, family members from those communities. So there's a lot of different connections, interconnected components that come together for those really, horrible incidents. But thank you for that. I want to move on to another question. So Neil asks, trauma and abuse have gone on since the beginning of time. So why is there so much more increased violence now?
Well, looking at the chart from 1970 to present, the incidents, the targeted violence, those kind of rampage attacks are occurring at close to the same frequency that they have back to 1970. So this is actually a multi-generational, 50-year plus issue. I focus on K through 12, but in 1966 is what people consider to be kind of the first modern mass shooter, and that was at University of Texas, and that was a person with a rifle up in the tower, shooting down on the campus for more than an hour there, and that was in 1966. So it's a great point that this cycle of trauma and abuse has occurred for a long period of time. What is different is the incidents are becoming more fatal than they were. So looking back at the ones in the 70s, 80s, 90s, up through Columbine, almost all of those involved either traditional rifles, shotguns, or handguns. And then the trend that's changed in the last few years is that semi-automatic rifles and high-capacity magazines have become more prevalent. And then, with some of the shootings that are those fights that escalate, students are now able to buy a lot of 3D printed parts online. So there's a simple part that can be purchased that turns a semi-auto handgun into a full auto handgun. And that's shootings with those have occurred at a couple schools in the past year. One at Miami Gardens in Miami, there was a dispute that turned into a targeted shooting. Two teens who were former students pulled up in front of the school. One had a Glock handgun that was modified for full auto with a 100-round drum magazine, and another had an automatic rifle. And they fired about 200 rounds into the front of the school at somebody they were targeting in front of it, and ended up hitting 3 kids in classrooms. One, the bullets had gone through 2 different classroom walls before they hit a kid in one of the classrooms. So that's just kind of the prevalence of the types of weapons have changed, the capacity of weapons have changed, the power of the ammunition and the ability to penetrate multiple walls, that's changed. So, it's gone from, Columbine was sawed-off shotguns, and now you're seeing, the Edmund Burke School, somebody with 1,000 rounds and 6 fully auto rifles, live streaming it through, digital optics.
Yeah. I'd like to turn this back over to Professor English. You might have some additional questions, but also kind of looking at our time, I want to make sure that, we give David an opportunity to wrap things up too, but I'm going to turn it over to Angie now.
Well, first of all, David, thank you so much. You've given us so much to think about and some good suggestions about leverage points where that first responders and Homeland Security professionals can intervene in a systems, particularly in relating to the trauma supports with schools and teaching teachers and school professionals to recognize trauma and knowing what to do with that particular kind of trauma and how to work with the community on a broader scale. One of the things that we've been talking about in our systems thinking class is that for the most part, Homeland Security and emergency management is very event centric. But as our problems become more and more complex, we've learned that we need to intervene at the enabling conditions and nodes within the community system. And so you've talked all through your time about that. So if you knew that if you could not fail, if you knew that up front, what would be some of the things that you would do as a first responder to prevent school shootings?
Yeah, really not as a first responder, but as a community member, I would try to implement crisis intervention programs in every school because it's really from the all hazards perspective. There's a youth mental health crisis across the country as well. And crisis intervention isn't just about stopping somebody from committing a mass shooting, but it's self-harm, it's suicide, it's depression, and those are all things that are increasing as well. And the ripple effects of those are enormous. So shortly after Uvalde, there was a situation at a high school where a student commits suicide in the cafeteria. And as soon as there was word of a shooting on the campus, a parent went to the school with a gun because they wanted to get in and find the shooter. And that could have turned into a situation where the parent was killed, police officers were killed, other people were killed. It escalated so quickly into, you know, a much more severe situation. So you have a student who's commits suicide, you have hundreds of students in the cafeteria that witnessed that, experienced that trauma, and then you have somebody's parent who now is facing very serious criminal charges for then trying to, you know, bring a gun and get past police into the school. When you try to trace back the pieces and all the points that failed and all the things that went wrong, it's going back to one person who was in crisis, that student who was suicidal. And if something was done to intervene before it got to that point of committing suicide in the cafeteria, then none of those other pieces of the chain would have occurred. So in emergency management, we're always looking at what's something that we can implement that is low cost and addresses lots of different things. And I think that there's a real opportunity with crisis intervention training for that to be something that has a whole host of benefits.
Well, thank you again. And thank you for everybody who's participated. So David, if people wanted to contribute to the continuance of the database, I know you're sort of doing this on your own time and your own energy. Where could they make a contribution to your database?
Yes, thank you so much, Angie. So on k12ssdb.org, or you can search K through 12 school shooting database, you will see the website, and there is a link on the right corner to donate. The donations go to the Violence Project Research Center. That is a joint project with myself, Dr. James Densley from Metro State, and Dr. Jillian Peterson from Hamline University. They've written a book called The Violence Project on stopping mass public shootings. We've co-published research on school shootings, and it's really a holistic program where we have a crisis intervention program that has been piloted in a couple school systems, as well as an off-ramps project, which is about kind of community-based intervention.
I see the donate button there. Lori's got a screenshot. There you go, right there. Okay, Miss Lori, back to you.
Well, I would just like to thank everybody for attending our webinar, and especially thank David for his time, his expertise, his diligence to continue to work through these. You've got amazing insights into all of these incidents, and where the commonalities are, and how some of them are uniquely different. But thank you so much for your time and sharing that with us. And I think we'll be ready to close it out. If we didn't get to your question tonight, I'm sorry, but let's be talking about that in the classroom. These are great insights. So we'll be making this link available as well for the recorded session. So thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you, David.